Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants event. My name is Joe Grabowski, and I'll be your host for today. For those who are new to Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants, we are all about bringing science, adventure, exploration, and conservation live into classrooms all over the world. Obviously, during these challenging times, we've switched gears a little bit, and we're broadcasting live into the homes of parents, students, and educators everywhere. So it's so great to be able to continue the learning every day with 3 to 4 live events, and to see so many groups who join us live via YouTube, as well as groups joining us live via our Zoom calls so they can interact directly. So we have a really great event planned for today. We've just started a series of events with the Duke Lemur Center. So this is our second one. We're continuing today with Matt Borths. He is a paleontologist who studies the evolution of animals in Africa, particularly the evolution of carnivorous mammals, including some of the oldest meat eaters that chase down our primitive primate ancestors. So as curator of the Duke Lemur Center's Division of Fossil Primates, he oversees over 30,000 specimens among the world's largest and most important collection of early anthropoid primates. So Matt, it is so great to have you joining us live today. We've got a great group joining us. We're excited to learn a little bit more about the work you do, the field work you do, and see some of those really amazing early specimens.
Well, thanks a lot, Joe. And I'm really excited to be able to share a lot of these with you. I'm actually able to speak to you directly from the fossil collection. So we're in an isolated building and all of the staff are working remotely except for me right now. So we've taken a lot of precautions, but it's really great that I can actually share a lot of the material that we have in our collection with everyone today. So I'd like to kind of get things started by telling the story of primates, because that's one of the things that's a really big area of focus for the Lemur Center and for the Division of Fossil Primates. And in order to tell the story of how this group of animals that we belong to got all over the world, it's important to show you a lot of maps. And so I want to start by showing you a map of where I am right now to kind of give you an anchor in space and talk a little bit about what the Lemur Center is and what it means to be at the Division of Fossil Primates.
All right, so I am going to be sharing my screen today. We're going to jump back and forth just a little bit, but I'm going to spotlight that video for everybody, and then you should see that PowerPoint kick in momentarily. There we go. And we're in action.
Awesome. So what we're looking at is a map of North America with North Carolina and Durham, North Carolina highlighted, which is where I'm speaking to you from, or we're speaking to you right now. And so on the next slide, there we go, that's close enough. I'm specifically speaking to you from Duke University, which is the home of the Duke Lemur Center. And the Duke Lemur Center is this institution that is a really important site for studying this group of animals that are called lemurs, which makes sense for their name. So in the next slide, the Duke Lemur Center and the Division of Fossil Primates is kind of nested within it. There's a couple of words in there that are maybe a little less familiar. Those words are lemur and primate. And so first I'm going to introduce you to what it means to talk about and work on lemurs. And so this might be the creature that you think of when you think of a lemur at first. This is an animal called a ring-tailed lemur. And it's one of over possibly 100 species of lemurs that live in Madagascar. So there's other species like the Mongoose Lemur that lives at the Duke Lemur Center, the blue-eyed black lemur, which is a very endangered species of lemur that we're responsible for at the Lemur Center, and the cockerel shafak, which is another very endangered creature. These animals eat leaves and obviously spend a lot of time in the trees, as do all lemurs. And they're very acrobatic, very energetic animals. They're able to spring off of trees using their powerful back legs to jump from tree to tree. And what you can see there in the background are trees. One of the things that makes the Lemur Center so special is that we actually have these huge open habitats that many of the lemurs are able to live in. And it lets them kind of live in natural social groups. And let them behave in a way that is much like the way they would behave in the wild in Madagascar. And it's really important for us at the Lemur Center to have this ability to study these animals because lemurs tell us a lot about what it means to be a primate. And we want to study them in the most natural way possible. All research done at the Lemur Center is all non-invasive research, which means a lot of what we do is basically watch the animals and see how they behave. And so when we kind of zoom out and think about what a lemur is, lemurs fit in the primate family tree. So on the left are the lemurs, And on the right, I've highlighted the apes, and specifically Homo sapiens, which is the type of primate that we all belong to. And so when we look at the different types of primates, there's a lot of different ways that we could categorize these animals. For instance, primates really like to live in trees. That's a trait that is shared by many types of primates. But unfortunately, I'm a paleontologist, and climbing in trees isn't something I can observe in the fossil record. Animals, when they're preserved and fossilized, aren't necessarily preserved like in the tree where they were living. And so as a paleontologist, I have to use traits that actually fossilize to figure out what a primate is, and then figure out how I found them in the fossil record. Because part of the reason I care about that is I want to connect the dots from lemurs to humans and kind of go through this whole journey of primate evolution to try to figure out kind of where lemurs fit and where we fit. One of the things that makes lemurs so special is they preserve a lot of traits that we think were present in some of the most ancient primates that ever lived millions and millions of years ago. So that's part of the reason we study them. So Joe, if you could switch back to my camera, I want to show you some of the traits that paleontologists use to try to figure out if we're working on a primate or not. And so here is that kind of primate family tree that I have printed out. And over here is our primate branch, or lemur branch of the primate tree. And right here is the skull and the paw of an animal that is not a lemur. This is a fox. And so you can tell it's a fox because it has these big sharp teeth that are up at the front of its jaw. And one of the things that makes a fox and many other types of mammals different from a primate is when we put it next to this creature. This is a ruffed lemur. And a ruffed lemur has this bone that connects its cheekbone here to the top of its skull. Its eyeball would have gone right in here. When we look at this fox, the fox's eyeball is here and its chewing muscles are back here, but there's no bone connecting the cheekbone to the top of the skull. And so one of the things that makes a primate is it's a creature that has this bony ring that creates this whole ring all the way around its eye. So when we look at a primate's skull, we can see this bone going all the way around it. We don't see that bone in this fox, and we don't see it in many other groups of mammals. So if we find something that has that ring, we know we're dealing with a primate. Another primate trait is when we look at the paws of most mammals have something on the ends of their fingers called claws. And those claws are actually part of the bone of their hand. Like there's a sheath that grows around it, but there's actually bone underneath that, creating the shape of this big pointy thing that help lots of different mammals grab onto stuff. One of the things that makes a primate different than other mammals is we have nails. And so when we look at the ends of the fingers, so this is the hand and this is the foot of a lemur, it has these really flat things on the ends of its hands. Those are the same things you have on the ends of your fingers. So the fact that you have fingernails and you have toenails is one of the clues that you are a primate. And because lemurs have fingernails on the ends of their toes and on the ends of their hands, we know that they are also primates. One of the things that makes a lemur different from other types of primates, so there's other primates in the world, along with us, apes over here, this blue branch here and this yellow branch here, those are animals that we call monkeys. And monkeys and apes share a trait that makes them different from primates. If we look at the face of this monkey, this is a capuchin monkey. A capuchin is one of these animals. Sometimes they're called organ grinder monkeys. They're really, really smart little monkeys that live in South America. This capuchin monkey has an eye socket. When we look at its face, there's this bone that goes all the way around the inside of its eye that would have surrounded its eyeball. The lemur has an opening behind its eye. You can actually see my finger kind of behind where its eyeball would have been. This is closed off. And so one of the things that makes a lemur different from a monkey when we look in the fossil record is if we find a monkey, it's an animal that has this eye socket. It's totally closed around it. So when I go in the fossil record, if I'm looking for a lemur relative, I'm looking for something that has this bony ring and fingernails. If I'm looking for a monkey relative, I'm looking for something that has the bony ring and an eye socket. And both of these animals are going to have fingernails. So that's kind of an introduction into basics of what it means to be a primate. So if I could go back to the presentation. One of the things that paleontologists really are fascinated by is where primates came from. Where do we find the first evidence of our primate relatives in the fossil record? And so we're looking for things that would have like this eye ring and fingernails. And so because lemurs are a group of animals that we think are very closely related, or not closely related, but they tell us a lot about kind of the ancestors of early primates. One place to go looking for these early fossils, you might think, would be the island of Madagascar, because Madagascar is where we find lemurs in the wild today. And so it makes sense that if there's lemurs there today, and lemurs are telling us a lot about what it means to be an early primate, then we should go to Madagascar to look for the fossils of early lemurs and early primates. And so the next question becomes like, how old would that animal have been? So one of the things that researchers have been able to do is actually compare the genetic evidence from lots of different groups of primates. And what they discovered is that primates probably originated sometime between 70 million years ago and 60 million years ago. And so researchers took that and went looking for rocks in Madagascar that were between 70 million years and 60 million years old. And what they found was a group of rocks in Madagascar that have some fossils in them that are about 66 million years ago. That is at the very end of the age of dinosaurs. So if we go to the next slide, Madagascar at that time, at the end of the age of dinosaurs, was already an island. It had broken off the coast of Africa a long time ago. India was a landmass that was very close to Madagascar at that time, but India would then move away from Madagascar and eventually go and collide with Asia, leaving Madagascar behind. And so in all of that kind of tectonic chaos, fossils were being deposited. And so a team of researchers, so we go to the next slide, I'll introduce you to some of them, led by Dr. David Krause, who's a researcher at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, leads teams into the part of Madagascar where we have rocks that might be from this window between 70 and 60 million years ago. And they have found lots of fossils. So if you go to the next slide, I actually had the privilege to go out and work with this team when I was a graduate student. And there have been lots of fossils discovered in Madagascar from the very end of the age of dinosaurs, with the idea being maybe some of these fossils will tell us something about the early story of primates. And so in the upper right, you can see some teeth of a big carnivorous dinosaur that was discovered. On the left, the team is hiking out to the field site where those teeth were discovered. And in the lower right is the team that was working in the quarry where that big meat-eating dinosaur was discovered. And so in the next slide, I'll introduce you to some of the animals that were discovered there. So this is an animal called Majungasaurus, which is this meat-eating dinosaur that had really, really short little front arms and a horn on the top of its head. It's like a true meat-eating unicorn that lived in Madagascar 66 million years ago. So this is one of the things that was discovered in Madagascar from 66 million years ago. On the next slide, I'll introduce you to some of the diversity of crocodiles that were found from that time. So crocodiles today are mostly animals that like to live in the water, and they eat stuff that comes down to take a drink or things that already live in the water. But in the past, there were all kinds of really cool experiments that crocodiles did. And so on the left is an animal called a Rarapasuchus, which is this coyote-like crocodile that could have galloped around. In the middle is this animal called Majungasaurus, which had a head that was really, really wide. I always think it looks like a big meat-eating toilet bowl. And on the right is this thing called Semasuchus, which is an armadillo-sized crocodile that only ate plants. And so all of these animals lived 66 million years ago in that window when we were thinking maybe there'll be some primates in these rocks. But on the next slide is an image of one of the mammals that was discovered in Madagascar. So this animal was only announced a few weeks ago. It's an animal called Adalatherium, which means the crazy beast. And it's crazy because it has features that it's definitely a mammal, but it's got weird legs. It's got like weird holes in its head. It is nothing like a primate. It's nothing really like any mammal that's alive today. And that's kind of the story of a lot of the mammals that we find in Madagascar from this time period. They're all mammals, but they're not in any way related to lemurs or to any of the mammals that live in Madagascar today. And so far, the fossil record of Madagascar tells us that it's not the place to look for the origins of the first primates, even though lemurs live there today. So the question becomes, how did lemurs get to Madagascar if they're not in the fossil record of Madagascar from this time period? And so on the if we go 2 slides ahead, we'll look at this big time slice. So far, paleontologists have been really fascinated by animals all over the world, and they've been looking especially for primates. And if we go 1 slide back, this is kind of the huge geological time scale. So far, all of the stuff from that red arrow down, no one has ever found any primate fossils from any rocks that are that old. And so that includes the Mesozoic, which is the age of reptiles, which when we had non-avian dinosaurs roaming the earth. But we have found primates in the top part of that. So in the next slide, thanks, Joe. This is the Cenozoic, the age of mammals. And we live in the Cenozoic right now. This time period started about 66 million years ago. And this is when we find some of the earliest primates. And if we want to tell the primate story, when we want to tell the story of how lemurs got to Madagascar, a lot of the fossils we need to study are going to be in rocks that are from the Cenozoic. And so when we look in Cenozoic rocks, what we discover is that early lemurs, or at least the relatives of lemurs, aren't found anywhere in the southern part of the world. Instead, we find early lemur fossils in the north. We find them in places like Asia and Europe and North America, which is really crazy because today, if you want to go looking for a lemur-like primate, it's really bad idea to go to North America. But in the past, it was the place to go and see these early lemur-like fossils. And so that time period, if we go to the next slide, at the beginning of the age of mammals, is this window that we call the Eocene, which means the dawn time. And some of the best exposures of Eocene rocks in the world that have primates are found in the western part of North America. So if we go to the next slide, this is the state of Wyoming in North America. And that little Notharctus that's crouched over the top, Notharctus is an animal that is related, we think, to the earliest kind of relatives of primates and the early relatives of lemurs. And it would have lived in Wyoming and what parts of the western United States that look very dry. So in the background, you can see what are called badlands. And badlands come by their name very honestly because they're very dry, very hot places where you don't want to spend a whole lot of time. But in the past, we know, on the next slide, that this was once a much more lush world. It would have had trees, it would have been green, it would have had small horses that were the size of dogs, it would have had lemurs-like primates hanging out in the trees, and it would have been a world that would have been very good for kind of the early primate story to get started. And so we go out to Wyoming searching for these animals because one of the things that's really special about what happened in Wyoming is, in the western part of the United States, is the Rocky Mountains. The Rocky Mountains popped up right around the time that early primate diversity was taking off in North America. The reason that's important is because as the mountains are getting pushed up, they then get eroded away. Erosion is the process of wind and rain and snow breaking down rock and making it into smaller rocks. Those smaller rocks get swept down by streams and creeks and eventually rivers and deposited in big sheets of rock that we call sedimentary rock. And sedimentary rock is where we find fossils. And so now I want to show you a video that I put together from clips that I took last year when I was able to go looking for fossils in Wyoming, looking especially for early primate fossils.
All right, Matt, I'm just going to take a quick pause here and reshare my screen.
Sure.
Don't think it's cooperating. And then Matt, I think if you can turn your camera lens for me, I think it's still facing front. And then I'll help you see the thumbs up a little bit better when the time comes. Perfect. All right. Let's see here. Back to the PowerPoint. And let's share from where we left off. That should take things a little better, nice and full screen for us. Okay. Let's get that video going. Let me try that one more time. I'm just not getting that nice full screen that I'd like, Matt. So just give me one more second.
So I can talk a little bit about what's going on. So one of the things that you'll be seeing in this video are some of the deposits we go to. There have been teams from Duke and from the Duke Lemur Center going out to look for primate fossils and other groups of animals. We don't just care about primates, but they are really important to us because they tell us a lot about where we came from. And so when we go out hunting for these early primate fossils, we're collecting other types of animals along the way. And there have been teams of researchers working out in the western part of the United States for over a century now. But the Duke Lemur Center has had teams going out for at least 4 decades. And so it's very exciting to get to participate and be part of this like larger legacy of the Lemur Center going and looking for the oldest primates that we've ever discovered. So here's North Carolina where we started. So going out west, and you can see the Rocky Mountains, the kind of like topography changes. And this is us kind of driving on the top of the plateau. Then we dip into the actual Badlands. And so in those Badlands, you can actually see these layers of rock. And each of those kind of changes in color is a different flood system. A different like layer represents a different depositional event. A tiny little person is walking out there. That's my colleague, Paul Morse, who's a postdoc here at Duke University. And he's walking along the surface of this, actually just looking for fossils, because there are so many fossils in these layers that you can just kind of walk around and see them sitting on the surface. And we mostly pick them up. So this is me kind of sitting in the outcrop. In the background are a branch of the Rocky Mountains that got pushed up. And as those erode and kind of they get smaller, they fill up the basin with all of the sedimentary rock that's under my hand. And so here I'm sitting on top of one of those layers of rock. And on the surface, it all looks like mud. It's this kind of like pebbly look because the rain and snow and wind has been beating up this layer of rock for hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years. But in those layers, we find fossils. So this is a fossil as it was sitting on the surface. So I haven't like staged this. This is the jaw of an ancient rodent that would have lived alongside early primates. And those are its teeth that you can see. The specimen's being recovered by Madison Bradley, who's a graduate student on the left here at Duke, and Dr. Doug Boyer, who's a researcher in early primates. We're working with John Alexander, who is at the Burke Museum in Seattle. And he's an expert at finding fossils in these rocks, especially primates. And sure enough, Alex found a skull of a primate. So this is actually in the rock. We're looking at the side of the brain case of a lemur-sized animal called Smilodectes. And so Dr. Boyer and Madison came over to take a look at it and to strategize how we were going to get this skull out of the rock, because it's this flat, really hard sandstone that we're working in. And the strategy we came up with required some brute force and a lot of blisters, because we had to go and get rock hammers and sledgehammers. And this is a time lapse of us trying to get that block out. And one of the things that's really important when we go collecting fossils is we actually remove that whole block that's now sitting in front of the camera. That block has been sitting in its place with that primate fossil for 50 million years. And so we want to keep as much rock around it as possible so that we know it's been protected. And this is me celebrating on the day that we found a primate, because they're very rare and very exciting to discover. And so it's worth spinning around in a field like Julie Andrews. So if I could have my camera back, Joe. Thank you. This is that block that we got out of the rock last summer. So it's like last July 3rd, we got this out. And so this is that skull exposed on the surface. And so we brought this whole block out. One of the things that we're planning to do with this is break it down and eventually get inside to figure out what's going inside. But fortunately, one of the things we can also do is we can put it in a 3D scanner. It's called a micro CT scanner, and we can look inside the rock. And so this is the scan of another rock that had a primate inside of it. This primate has now been exposed from the rock itself. So what you're looking at here is this is the skull of this animal. This is its upper arm bone, its backbone, its hips, its tail, its leg, and then another leg here. These are all from the scan. Then a researcher called a fossil reparator, who's an expert at removing fossils from the rock, was able to go in and actually expose the fossils in the rock themselves. And so here we're looking at that fossil that we scanned. This is the hip bone. This is the shin bone. This is the backbone here, the hips, the tail curling back. And then here's the upper part of the skeleton. So here's the upper arm bone and the shoulder. This is the most complete early primate skeleton that's ever been discovered. And it belongs to this animal called Neotharctus. And so the question becomes, how do we know that we're dealing with a primate? And the way that we know is when we look at it, you can see it has this ring going all the way around its eye, just like what we saw on the lemur. And so that tells us that we found a primate. Also, because we have the hands and the feet, we have actually the ends of the fingers. And we can see that there are little fingernails on the ends of this animal's hands and feet. So we know that we're dealing with an ancient primate relatives. And so this is actually the complete skull of this animal, of the most complete early lemur-like primate that's ever been discovered. And so this skeleton was scanned, and this skeleton we're still waiting to get out of the rock. We found another primate skull that I'm going to show you kind of the end result. When we bring the rock out of the lab, when we bring it back into a museum, a lot of research actually happens in a museum. You'd think it happens in the field, but it's here that we actually remove the rock and can expose more of the material. And so this is the skull of another Smilodectes that was discovered in that same rock formation that's about 50 million years old. And so again, you can see this ring of bone going all the way around its eye. So we know we're dealing with another primate. And this is the side of the brain case that's exposed that Alex found when he was prospecting for fossils in Wyoming. This is basically what he found sitting in the rock. And so we think that we have another skull of this very, very rare primate called Smilodectes. This lab is the workspace for Carrie Whitman, who's the fossil preparator here at the Lemur Center. And she has a really important job in basically taking these fossils out of the rock so that we can actually see what's going on inside the bones of these animals. So with that, I'd like to, if there's time for some questions, and I can continue the epic journey of primates from North America to Madagascar after taking some questions if you guys have any.
All right, sounds good, Matt. So those who are joining us in the YouTube call, you can use the chat sidebar on the right and send us in a couple questions. We'll work a few of those in now. Those who are right in the Zoom call with us, if you either put something in the chat bar or if you click participants and look on the right, you should be able to see a raise your hand option. You can raise your hand virtually, and I will see that little blue hand and I'll know to ask you a question. And in fact, we've got Dylan in North Carolina, so maybe not too far from you, Matt. And he had his hand. Oh, he just put it down. Dylan, do you have a question?
Yes. So I live in Hillsborough, North Carolina, so I'm like right across the street from you. And my question is, what inspired you to become a archaeologist?
That's a really important question. I think that part of what inspired me to become a paleontologist and an archaeologist is also someone who studies really old stuff, and I was really interested in archaeology too, is I've always been really interested in knowing where things come from. When I was younger, I was interested in dinosaurs, and I was interested in fossils and woolly mammoths and saber-toothed cats, but I was also really interested in where words come from. When I learned that things like Tyrannosaurus rex means tyrant lizard king, I then was really curious about like where'd that word come from and why do we use it that way. And I've also always been interested in history. And so in some ways, I think of paleontology is the history of everything. It's the question of how everything that we see in the world, whether it's humans and our role in the ecosystem, where continents came from, and then how organisms live on those continents, all of that is all part of paleontology. And so part of what inspired me to ultimately become a paleontologist was just my fascination with wanting to go further and further back to see where things come from. And along the way, I had some really important mentors who helped teach me how to be a paleontologist. That's a really important part of being a scientist, is working closely with other scientists and other teams. And so I'm continually inspired by the researchers that I work with when I go out looking for fossils. Like I kind of every day have to decide how much I really care about fossils. And the people I work with continue to inspire me to keep doing this. And it's been a really exciting journey.
All right, great question to start us off. Jean, you sent me a good question in the chat sidebar. Do you want to unmute your mic?
So, fascinating. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
I wanted to know, I didn't realize that it's interesting. We don't have monkeys in North America now, but you mentioned lemurs were here. When did they stop existing? Like, was that the last ice age?
Yeah, that's actually a really important question, and one that we're still working out all the details of. But as far as we can tell, the last primate probably went extinct in North America around like 28 million years ago. Basically, with the time period we're talking about is the Eocene. And the Eocene is this like flourishing of primate diversity in North America. But then we move into a time period called the Oligocene. And the Oligocene in North America is a time when the continent starts to dry. We start to get the first kind of inklings of grasslands starting to develop. And that kind of fragments the forests, and primates need forests. And so that kind of large scale climate change that was related to kind of drying out the continent is probably one of the things that caused a lot of primates in North America to go extinct. And so they would have been extinct long before the Ice Age. And so that means that humans are kind of the first primates to come back when the first kind of native peoples start to arrive in North America thousands of years ago. There have been no primates in North America for a very long time. But working out all the kind of details of why and when and where the last primates lived and went extinct is something that is a big question that a lot of researchers are working on.
All right. So Matt, I'm going to take one YouTube question and one more live question, then we can dive into the next portion. So this first one is Lynette. Lynette is wondering, what was the first lemur fossil that you found?
Oh, actually, the first lemur fossil that I found was the one that I just showed you. That block that we excavated. I had looked at lemur fossils in museums because museums have a really important role basically as libraries for science. So all these cabinets that I have behind me are all filled with specimens, and each of those specimens has a number, and we have a catalog. And so researchers can come into a collection like this and check out the fossils. They can open the drawers and look at them and compare them with other fossils they found. But it's just in the field where we go discover new things. And so I had looked at lemur fossils in museums before, but until last summer, I hadn't actually found one of these early lemurs in North America myself. So it was really exciting to actually have that opportunity.
All right. And Nima, if you want to pop your mic on, we'll take one more question before we dive into the presentation a little deeper.
How do you figure out how old rocks are?
That has been a really big job for lots of geologists working for decades now. One of the ways that we can figure out how old rocks are is by just kind of saying how old they are relative to other rocks. So if you have a rock that's formed underneath another rock, you know that rock has got to be older than another one. But that's not very satisfying. We want to know exactly how old that thing is. And so one of the things that we use is geochemistry. One of the things that we know about the world is that atoms, the stuff that makes up things like rocks and you and me and the cabinets behind me, is that some atoms over time break down and change over long periods of time. And so rocks have atoms that change over time. And geochemists can actually go in and figure out how old a rock is by looking at how much the atoms inside of it have changed over time. And so that's part of how we're able to go in. We basically take a rock sample and take it back to a lab, usually at a university, where they're able to kind of count the different numbers of these changing atoms to figure out how old a rock is. That's called radiometric dating. One form of that you might have heard of radiocarbon dating. So that's when you look at the atoms of carbon and how they're changing. But you can also study other types of atoms. You can study things like potassium and argon. And those are rocks that tell us how old it is by how it's changed over time.
All right, really good question. So we're gonna, Matt, if you're ready, I can slide back into the presentation.
All right.
All right.
Because now we have to get from North America to Africa. And there have been teams from the Duke Lemur Center that have been working in Africa for a really long time because Africa is close to Madagascar. So it makes sense that if you're trying to track how primates got from North America and Europe and Asia, eventually to Madagascar, you have to go through Africa because it's kind of in the way. And so one of the places that we go is a series of fossil sites in northern Africa in a country called Egypt. Egypt is kind of on the north coast of Africa along the Mediterranean Sea. Here we go. And so the rocks that we find there are basically halfway in time between when we're living right now and the extinction of the dinosaurs. And so they are tens of millions of years younger than the rocks that we were looking in Wyoming. And one of the things that we've discovered in Egypt, so if we go to the next slide, I can kind of show you, we've shifted a little bit closer. It's still really old, And it's at the end of this time period called the Eocene going into the Oligocene, which is this time period when things like North America really start to dry out and the world changes a lot. In the next slide, you can see what this part of Egypt looks like today. It's the Western desert of Egypt. And so it's very dry, open. It's basically part of the Sahara Desert. But if we go to the next slide, there's a lot of people who like to go out in this desert and go looking for fossils. And so I had the privilege of being part of this fossil research team as well. And it includes researchers like Hisham Salam from Mansoura University, who leads a group of Egyptian paleontologists out to collect fossils in this really remote area of the Sahara Desert. On the next slide, you can see another image of just how dry this place is. It's basically like a giant sandbox, but in it, we can actually find fossils. And it's very different collecting fossils here because the fossils actually just kind of brush out of the sand. Unlike Wyoming, where we have this really hard rock, we have just kind of like this soft sandstone that's covering everything. It's like being in a sandbox and brushing away looking for fossils. On the next slide is a temple from ancient Egypt that's actually in the same site as the Fayum. So we overlap with archaeologists. So archaeologists are people who study human artifacts, things that people put together. And so I, like Dylan from North Carolina asked, I've always been interested in archaeology and paleontology. So one of the things that's really exciting about working in this part of Egypt is I get to look at ancient Egyptian artifacts kind of on the way to the field sites. But what the world used to look like in the Fayum was this. It's this very lush kind of Everglades-like world that had early elephants, it had manatees, it had crocodiles. It didn't look like the Sahara Desert at all. And one of the things that we find there are early primates. And so this is an animal called Egyptopithecus. And Egyptopithecus is one of the oldest common relatives of monkeys and apes. And one of the ways that we can tell that it's a relative of monkeys and apes is it has an eye socket. And on the next slide is another primate. So alongside the monkey and ape relatives are relatives of lemurs. And so on the bottom is the jaw of an animal called Plesiopithecus. And Plesiopithecus is related to the eye, which is the animal on the top of this slide. The eye is a very weird lemur that lives in Madagascar today. And we also have some of them living at the Lemur Center. These animals have really, really long front teeth that they use for kind of chewing into the barks of trees where they go after food. They like to eat things like grubs and bugs that live under the bark of trees. So they have these long teeth. Plesiopithecus has these long teeth in its jaw. And so it's evidence that we have lemurs living alongside early monkey relatives in these rocks from Egypt. And so if I get my camera back, I'm going to show you what those actual fossils look like because we have them here in the lab. So here is the drawer where we keep Egyptopithecus and its monkey relatives. So like I said, museums are basically a library of science. And so when we go into these, you can see that there are numbers that go with each of these specimens. And so researchers can pull them open and we find things like this is the face of Egyptopithecus, which means the Egyptian monkey. And so here we're looking at the face of this animal. One of the things that we can see in some of these fossils of Egyptopithecus, here's another face of Egyptopithecus, is Egyptopithecus has an eye socket. There's a bone kind of closing the back of the eyeball of this specimen. So that tells us we're looking at something that's more closely related to a monkey or to an ape than to a lemur. But we also find Plesiopithecus, which is this lemur-like animal. This is the top of its skull. So we're looking at, this is the front of the snout. We're missing the brain case back here, but its eyeball would have gone here. And there's no indication of any kind of eye socket on this animal. And then here's the jaw that has the super long tooth that looks a lot like an eye tooth. So this is the isolated, it's a 3D print of the tooth of an eye. That's this really, really long thing that we also see in Plesiopithecus. So we know that lemur relatives got to at least Egypt by about 34 million years ago. But now we need to get them to Madagascar. And so if we pull up the slides one more, thank you so much, Joe, for running the slides on this. And so We get them in Africa, but then we ultimately have to get our lemurs to Madagascar. And one of the ways that we know they got there is we find eyes in Madagascar today, but we don't find anything like Plesiopithecus living in Egypt. And so lots of animals have made it to Madagascar. Madagascar disconnected from Africa during the time of the dinosaurs. So lemurs had to get to Madagascar another way. They had to cross the ocean. And the way that they did that, we think, is by floating on natural rafts. Basically, there are chunks of forest along the coast of West Africa that are at the mouths of rivers that in really, really big storms sometimes will break off and they float across the ocean. And we think that an early relative of eyes and other lemurs was on one of those natural rafts sometime between about 40 million years ago and 20 million years ago. And they crossed the ocean and colonized Madagascar. Now that sounds kind of crazy and like a really hard thing for lemurs to do. But some of the supporting evidence we have that this is likely what happened is we have other groups of mammals that arrived in Madagascar, and based on comparing their genetic evidence, their genes, to their relatives that live in mainland Africa, we think they also split off and somehow made it to Madagascar during this window between 40 and 20 million years ago. And so there's a group of animals called tenrecs, which are kind of small hedgehog or shrew-like animals that live in Madagascar. We have things like the Fusa, which is the carnivore group that lives in Madagascar. And we have some rodents that are native to Madagascar that all seem to have made this journey across the Mozambique Channel, which is the part of the Indian Ocean that divides Africa from Madagascar. And they arrive and then diversified. And so today we have 100 species of lemurs that came from probably only a small founding population, with the arriving separate from the other groups of lemurs. So now we've arrived. We went from Wyoming across the northern continents into Africa, across Africa, and across the ocean to finally land in Madagascar, where lemurs can really take off and become the fascinating group of primates that we study today at the Duke Lemur Center. So now that we've landed in Madagascar, if anybody has any other questions, I know we're running a little long, but I'm happy to take as many as we can.
All right, perfect. Let's get back from that screen share. All right, so I will take some questions from the live chat. I'll take some questions from right here in the Zoom call. Let's start off. Jana's iPad, looks like your hand is up. You want to unmute for me?
So I was wondering, what was your favorite thing that you saw in when you were digging up fossils?
I think my favorite thing that I saw when I was digging up fossils is I really, really like just being out in these really remote areas of the world. And so I'm there studying ancient ecosystems that are 50 million or 35 million years old, but there's also an ecosystem around me at the same time. So there are pronghorn antelope that live out west. There are eagles soaring overhead. There are desert foxes in Egypt that run through camp at night. And being able to see the kind of modern ecosystem around me is a really exciting part of going out and looking for fossils, along with looking for the fossils themselves. And you saw that I had to do a little bit of a Sound of Music impression when I saw the primate fossils we discovered in Wyoming. So I get pretty excited about finding the fossils too.
All right, let's grab a YouTube question or two. So Stephanie S is wondering if you know who the first person was who discovered a lemur.
The first person who discovered a lemur. The first person who discovered a lemur would have been someone who colonized Madagascar. Madagascar is an island that, even though it's really close to Africa, which is where our species, Homo sapien, came from, we don't think that humans have been living on Madagascar for that long. The language that's spoken in Madagascar, which is called Malagasy, is actually really closely related to languages that come from places like Indonesia. And so those languages tell us that the people who colonized Madagascar are related to people all the way across the Indian Ocean. And so there was a group of people who came across the Indian Ocean and probably got off their boats. There were lots of cultures at the time that were very good at moving from island to island. So they moved all the way across the Indian Ocean, colonized Madagascar. They brought with them things like rice, and they brought with them things like domesticated animals, and they started to make a living on the island. And they would have been the people who would have met some of the first lemurs in Madagascar. And some of those lemurs included some really amazing creatures like this animal, This is a creature called Megalatopus. And Megalatopus means the giant lemur. This animal, this is the size of a gorilla skull. And this is Megalatopus. So this is a gorilla-sized lemur that would have lived in Madagascar when the first humans arrived a couple thousand years ago. This animal has since gone extinct. And one of the other research projects we work on here at the Lemur Center is trying to figure out why these giant lemurs went extinct in recent time, living alongside humans. But those would have been some of the animals that the first lemur discoverers, these first humans in Madagascar, would have seen.
All right, pretty cool. So we've got Ada joining, and Ada's curious about the lemurs not having that full eye socket. Do you think that affects how they see any different from how the primates see with that full closed-in socket?
That is a really fascinating question, because it is this big difference between lemurs and monkeys. And lots of people have spent a lot of time and energy trying to figure that out. And so far, we don't really know. Sometimes that's the answer that science gives us. Given the data we have so far, we don't really know what the advantage of having an eye socket is. One hypothesis is there's a lot of chewing muscles that are right behind the eyeball. Lemurs have really long, thin heads. They look a little bit more in profile like a dog because they have these big, long noses. Compared to a monkey, which is here on the right, monkeys have short faces. And so one hypothesis is maybe there's something about the shape of the head of a lemur compared to the shape of a head of a monkey, that having that extra wall of bone helps your chewing muscles from like pushing on the back of your eye, maybe. But that really is a very tentative idea, and there's not a lot of really good evidence. So that's something that you could discover if you are interested in primate evolution. There are big questions. I know today I talked about a lot of discoveries, but there's so much more to learn. And a lot of the details of things like where and when fingernails came from and the back of the eye socket, all of that is still open for all kinds of discovery.
All right, that's such a good point, Matt, is that you might go out in the field with 10 questions, but come back with 100 more. That's just
Exactly.
that's the thing about good science. Dars, do you want to unmute for me? You can go ahead and ask your question. Okay, I see you unmuted, but I can't hear you. Okay, Dars, maybe just send me your question in the chat bar and I'll look out for it. Thamira, do you want to unmute your microphone?
What's the difference between the mongoose lemur and just a normal mongoose?
So that's a really important, really kind of confusing thing. Like some animal names will like combine multiple animals in their name. So the mongoose is a type of carnivore. And so a mongoose is a relative of, it would sit in the same family as a dog or a cat or a hyena. Whereas a mongoose lemur, because it's a lemur, is a primate. So it's more closely related to a monkey or to you and me than it is to a mongoose. But the first person who saw the mongoose lemur, who is from Europe, who gave it that name, thought that its colors look a lot like a mongoose. Mongooses have this kind of like dark brown coloration and some like little suggestions of stripes and some like a lighter stomach. And so the person who saw the mongoose lemur thought that it looked a little bit like a mongoose. And so they weren't very creative. And instead of giving it its own special name, they were like, oh, it's a lemur that looks like a mongoose. We'll call it a mongoose lemur.
All right, fair enough. So Matt, there's someone tuning in named Drew, and Drew says they're a friend from high school and they're really excited to see you teaching. So I wanted to pass that message.
Hi, Drew.
And then we've got a couple questions about getting the fossil out of the rock. So one question from YouTube is, can you tell us a little bit about the process of getting the rock out of those skulls? And then a question from right here in the call is wondering if you've ever broken a fossil while trying to extract it.
Yes, so both of those things. So the easy question to answer is yes, I have broken fossils. And it's sometimes called the quarry tax. So quarry is where you're digging up fossils. And the quarry tax is when you just have to pay your dues because you discovered the fossil. Sometimes things get broken along the way. We try not to, but sometimes the rock just won't let you have it any other way. So actually, I can show you that Smilodectes skull, that skull that Carrie is working on, that's back here in her lab. Its jaw, you can see here, is broken. So it's sitting upside down. So here's our skull. And so its jaw was actually attached. This fossil was preserved upside down. It's like jaw was sticking out of the rock like this. And so one of the tasks that Carrie's been working on is reassembling. We collected all the pieces of the jaw, and she's slowly gluing them all back together again. So these are scraps of teeth, and she's putting it together like a tiny, tiny puzzle to try to put together all of the pieces that got busted, both by us excavating the fossil to begin with, but also because it was exposed on the surface. So this was also broken by wind and rain and snow in Wyoming. One of the things that, because we're going to be doing these check-ins from the Lemur Center every week, hopefully some in the near future, I'll introduce you to Carrie, and she can actually host one of these and talk about the process of becoming a fossil preparator and talk about the science of getting fossils out of the rock. But in short, it's its own type of paleontologist. She's been training for over a decade of trying to learn the best way to use different glues and other kinds of solvents that we basically have, like reversible plastic glue that's used to kind of put fossils together. She uses this machine, which is called a microscribe. It's basically like it's a piston-driven thing. It's like a little jackhammer, basically, that you put a little jack on the end of that and blast away at the rock very carefully to actually get the rock off of the fossil. And so it's its own branch of science is how we do that. And so that's kind of a glance at how we do it. But Carrie hopefully can tell you more about that in the future.
All right, very cool. Let's see, let's squeeze in one more question here. I see someone in the call with us. Ajazan has a question. Do you want to unmute your mic, Ajazan, if you still have that question?
What is the longest lemur that you have researched about?
The longest lemur I've researched?
Yeah.
Do you mean
Yeah,
size,
cool.
Bud, or the one he's worked on the longest?
Like, what have you been have you been, what is the longest lemur that you have worked about so far?
So some of the longest ones are these really big lemurs. So I showed you that skull of Megalatopus, but we have more than just one skull. So this is one of our drawers that has Megalatopus material. This is one of the largest lemurs. And so here we have a jaw of Megalatopus, this big kind of gorilla-sized animal. So that's one of the longest. But one of the things that we know about Megalatopus is we have parts of its hips. So here you can see some of this is a leg bone. It's called a femur. It's like its hip bone. It didn't have a tail, so it wouldn't be all that long because it doesn't have a tail. I think probably one of the longest lemurs is this animal. This is called Archaea Lemur, which means the ancient lemur. This animal was discovered in a cave. And so this fossil is covered in what's called flowstone. And that flowstone covered the entire rock. And so we have to go and look after someone like Carrie, like a preparator has spent a lot of time with it. You excavate and find the full skull of this. And so Archaea Lemur is one of these giant extinct lemurs that only went extinct maybe 500 years ago, but it would have had a tail. And so this animal would have been about the size of like a golden retriever. But its tail, because it's a lemur, probably would have been a little bit longer, maybe like 3 feet long. So it's probably one of the longest lemurs because it would have had this long tail. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Cool, thank you.
All right, perfect. Well, Matt, I want to start off by giving a huge shout out to YouTube. Thank you to everybody who joined us today and sent in the great questions. I want to give a shout out to our groups who joined us live today. In fact, we got to visit one more before I forget. Gila's class is joining us, Mrs. Charles. How are you? Oh, you'll have to unmute for me, Mrs. Charles.
Hey.
There we go. Can we grab a couple questions from your class before we sign off today?
We won't have questions today. First time trying it out, a little bit of technical difficulty. So maybe next time.
Okay, no worries.
I've been trying to get my kids to ask a question in my chat, and I've been having a few difficulties. So maybe next time, next one.
Okay, no worries at all.
Well, I should say that at fossils.duke.edu is my contact information. So if anyone has any questions they'd like to shoot that way, you're welcome to get in contact with me. If there's technical difficulties asking questions now.
All right, perfect. Well, Matt, that was great. I mean, it's so amazing to have this massive part of history at your fingertips, where you can jump into these different drawers, find these primate ancestors, find ancestors of the lemurs, and piece together their life, their evolution, their travels around the planet. It's absolutely incredible. Thank you so much for taking us into your world today.
Thank you so much for having me, for hosting me, and for running the slideshow, and for everyone else for tuning in. This was a lot of fun, and hopefully there's more fossil stories to tell in the future.
All right, very cool. Well, we definitely look forward to our next deep dive into the fossil collection. Thanks again, Matt. Thank you, everybody who tuned in today. Thank you, Duke Lemur Center, and we are going to sign off for today.